Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 489, April the 19th, 1981. The title of the program this evening is Happy Birthday, Adolf. Tomorrow, Adolf Hitler will have a birthday, April the 20th, 1889. There are a lot of you that believe it's impossible for a person to live to be 90 or 91 years old, but there are people, in fact, who have lived that age, and a lot of researchers take issue with the point that I make about Adolf Hitler possibly being alive. But I've read every book that is available on the death of Adolf Hitler and the sources that wrote the books. That's very important, who wrote the books and the descriptions of the possible escape. And I've mentioned on other programs, and I'll do more later, it's quite a victory for Adolf to look back after so many years of his Reich and realize how far along it's come. He's only had, 50 or 51 years out of that 1,000-year Reich, but he's doing very well, I should say, or 61 years. It's moving right along as planned, and he should be very satisfied with the progress. The man is a total genius, misunderstood, and I don't think there's been enough written about the mind of Hitler. There have been books on the mind of Adolf Hitler, but it's like writing about the mind of Sirhan or Lee Harvey Oswald or John Hinckley Jr. There's no relationship between the training and the background of these people and their willingness to be used and be placed for strategic purposes that have a historical goal in mind. There is no book yet written on these people as real people who fire the imagination of what the world is really like. That's why Hitler is so brilliant, because he knew what people really wanted. We cite the Constitution and the liberties, but people don't really want that liberty. And I'll do a show, maybe broadcast in a few weeks to come, some information on why I have reason to believe he's alive. One story, a person in particular, but there's 3 different people who don't know each other who've told me about incidences that make me believe and make me research the past. This is the end of Easter evening, the Passover season. The religious groups celebrate peace and birth, the symbol of the egg, but they don't mean it. They are hypocrites. Hitler gives them what they mean, and the pastor gives them the rationalization, or the rabbi, for what they publicly want to throw out as their image. They're simply putting colors of paint or layers of disguise over the real people, and Hitler went deep into the real people. There's some famous Jews such as Freud and Jesus, Einstein. He took all of them and made fools of them. Freud went into the subconscious, but never the real political subconscious. He went into sexual problems and hang-ups as they affect our behavior. But Hitler's the genius that took the minister of propaganda and the big lie and went beyond what Freud was thinking about and tapped the real well, or the core of people with hostilities and angers and frustrations from very early periods, and how they used them for profits and power. And he used the mind better than Freud could ever set an example for us to do. The same way that Albert Einstein could have his theory of relativity and the atom science, Hitler took it to the nth degree to space stations, laser weapons. Those space shuttles were built by the Nazi scientists, therefore warfare in space for future genocide. He took the atom and saw that the atom controls the world. The theory of relativity only is vague to a lot of people, but Adolf Hitler knew how to use it, and he did it so well that his scientists were brought to the United States. And the same way the church and Hitler used Jesus. The church doesn't use religion the way it's supposed to be used, or we wouldn't be on the brink of the Third War and genocide and torture and killings all over the world with massive lies of public figures and politicians. The church has no purpose except to disguise the real you underneath, and Hitler knew how to use the church to round up any thinking people or free-thinking people opposed to real fascism, blood and guts fascism. So he took the minds of Freud and Jesus and Einstein and other people and took everything out of them that he saw useful to his needs, and the people have followed his needs, not what the other men had to offer at all, not peace or science and energy for everybody, or free from guilt and happiness by going back into our psyche and finding the thorns that pricked us when we were little. We haven't used these men or philosophers or great people that have come along for anything. We've turned our back on them and followed those marching footsteps and armbands like a bunch of sheep or ants that we are. And I think there is a lot more to be written about the common bond that Hitler has with the world of reality, as I say, not what we think it is, but the way it really is and the way it functions on a day-to-day basis. I received another telephone call from Marina Oswald this week. This time she wanted me to talk to a gentleman named John. I didn't ask for the last name. I started to, but figure what's the difference? If his intent isn't good, he could make up a name. If it's good, he wouldn't want to tell me on the phone. And we had a conversation about some more things in Dallas, about her friend Anna Meller, who she thought was a Nazi. I talked about Alexander Zeiger, who ran the radio factory in Minsk, the man that Lee Harvey Oswald worked for, who introduced Marina to Lee. And I asked her if she knew that the CIA had taken the Zeiger girls down to Argentina while the Warren Commission was doing their work. There are a lot of things that she was in the middle of that I'm sure she never had access to, and the researchers that she's known, such as Bernard Fensterwald and Mary Farrell, and that Texas gang that she speaks with, and other researchers around the country, are at a 0.2 on a scale of 10 of getting information out. So even if they were good intentioned, and most of them aren't, many of them are just cover-up artists, she's completely in the dark about some of the machinery of American politics. So we talked at length, and maybe she'll call again. Maybe she wants to know just how much I know. I am not impressed by the fact that she calls. Without Marina Oswald and Ruth Paine, there would be no Lee Harvey Oswald killed John Kennedy story. The Warren Commission found it so necessary to have her seal in the personality of the assassin rather than to check the autopsy reports and the bullet trajectory or the pristine bullet or the clothing of the people John Kennedy and John Connally shot in the car, or the lack of fingerprints on the weapon or other Mausers in the building in the book depository. Instead of going for the hard evidence of the criminal case, they relied on Marina Oswald and Ruth and Michael Paine, but particularly Marina Oswald. So if she complains now that history fingers Lee Harvey Oswald, she was afraid of deportation, and she was brought in by the Defense Department and Navy intelligence. So even if her brainwashing is wearing off, it would be difficult for her to catch up with the past 17 years of information that has come out. But it's interesting that she has called me twice in the past week and a half. And tomorrow the Secret Service, or Tuesday, the Secret Service is coming down from San Francisco to check out that character, John, who I said was at the house. They asked me what difference does it make if he's in Carmel or not. It matters a lot, and this John had a white car, the same physical description, the same face, parked in front of my house, wanted to live there or wanted to do electrical work for me, was looking for a woman who speaks German. I thought there was a big gap in the chronology of John Hinckley from October the 9th to January 21st of 1981, from 1981, and then from January 21st up till March. There's all of those time gaps that are not filled in, and you can see why. The FBI and Secret Service don't want to fill in the time places that they were at, and the safe houses where they stay are never exposed. And the reason being is that you would know the paths of people, the traveling of Lee Harvey Oswald or Sirhan Sirhan or James Earl Ray or Arthur Bremer or John Hinckley or Mark David Chapman. If you really found out who paid the money for their trips and the hotels and the phone calls and the people they meet and the safe houses in New York, I understand that Mark David Chapman the week before, or the evening, as late as near the evening when he shot John Lennon, he was escorted by a taxi cab to various houses in New York City, apartment houses, and the driver was a student, a graduate student of law at NYU. We don't go to those houses, the investigators, and find out who they saw or why they were there, if they were picking up their money or being programmed or hypnotized, because then you would break the chain of command of these assassins, and there's a lot of dwellings and safe houses and a lot more assassins being nurtured and grown right now. So it's easier for the Justice Department, the FBI, to say we have found no evidence of a conspiracy, or there's not a scintilla of truth to the conspiracy, because the truth is that there isn't any that they look for. They don't look for it, so therefore they don't find it. There's one problem that's on my mind that I think we should watch, because I have hinted or suggested that we'll look for Ronald Reagan to get sick and have a slow recovery. Last week I kept the articles of Reagan's affairs and asked the question, where is the President of the United States and when will he make future appearances? It was a big day for the United States aerospace industry when the shuttle landed, and there was a picture in the newspaper of Vice President Bush speaking with the astronauts on the telephone. That was April the 14th. Why wasn't Ronald Reagan on the telephone? He loves to do that kind of thing. If he is available, why shouldn't he be able to say congratulations as the President of the United States? There's another picture of Haig awarding honors, medals to the former hostages. Why wasn't Reagan well enough? Why couldn't they come into the White House? They already were entertained there when they came home. Why couldn't they put this off again? Because Bush and Haig are doing these official processes and getting their name in the news. Betty Beale, an article from a Washington syndicated column that was in the Monterey Herald, Reagans are having dinner for Prince Charles May the 2nd in the dining room upstairs. Now, there's nothing that Nancy and Ronald Reagan like better than monarchy, and particularly the kind that just haven't shot their way in, like the President of Jamaica or South Korea. So it would be very nice to have the distinguished Prince Charles, and they're wanting desperately to get an invitation to that wedding anyway. But instead of having a nice dinner for him downstairs, they've invited him upstairs. Is it a fact that by April the 19th that the President can't be downstairs for dinner? He spent his Easter upstairs with a private church service, and he is not seen by the public. His Easter celebrations today were not seen at all by anyone in the public. The only picture or comment of Ronald Reagan as the acting president that stood out was a picture of a parade of elephants with a title, "Elephants Attract Reagan." Is he relegated to circus parades and selected visitors such as Mr. Weinberger and Bush and Haig? The Defense Department and the Pentagon and Navy intelligence, of course, are in there with him. But outside of that, is he relegated to standing at the window and looking at elephants? And don't forget that when they were seen in the Rose Garden and he was downstairs walking in the Rose Garden, hand in hand, his back view, he had his back to the camera, which I don't think Ronald Reagan has done even since his B or C or D movies, walking away, holding hands with his wife. You have not seen him walking forward or talking, except for the time they left the hospital and went into the White House. He went up the steps, and I believe they said, "How do you feel?" And he said, "Fine," and went up to the White House. Now, if he can be down in the Rose Garden, he could be down for dinner with Prince Charles. So there is something definitely wrong, and my first judgment is that they're going to phase him out and give a lot of function and authority to Bush, who was director of the CIA, and to Alexander Haig, the protege of Fritz Kramer and Adolf Hitler's cohorts and students. Maybe they wanted a military coup and hoped that that bullet 1 inch from the brain would work before Hitler got too old and died off. Maybe his goal was to have Alexander Haig and Weinberger gung-ho for war against Russia, his lifelong dream, which would prove that if we had had our way, we would have followed him in those days instead of waiting so long because of the danger and expense. Now, Hitler becomes a hero to a lot of people because he, in quotes, forewarned us. But what we have in government are the very people from Hitler's government who have made our foreign policy and continued what he wanted instead of having it otherwise and getting any voices of sanity or opposition to these crazy policies. One of the things I want to bring up with the Secret Service on Tuesday is the possibility of a connection of John Warnock Hinckley with the black murders that are going on around the country. I did a tape in September of 1980, tape 460, and one of the subjects was hunting season inside the United States, get the blacks. I understand in Atlanta, Georgia, there were handbills sent out this last week, open hunting season for blacks, and somebody had forged the name of the officials there. And I had listed the Buffalo murders, the Salt Lake City murders, the sniper attacks on the Muni buses in San Francisco. Well, the person who was charged and convicted for the murders in Salt Lake City of the black men jogging with the white women, Joseph P. Franklin, his wife had an interview a while back in November, and she said that he acted like he was a secret agent. He was always moving to avoid capture. He had 18 aliases. He changed guns and cars, and he was frequently dyeing his hair. Now, when John Hinckley was at the airport in Tennessee and was apprehended with 50 rounds of hollow ammunition and handcuffs, which handcuffs was one of the things that made me see a picture of being able to capture people from Atlanta, Georgia, and take them elsewhere. And he had 3 guns. He told the judge he was in law enforcement, and therefore he wasn't fingerprinted by the FBI and was released. And I took a map and started charting the course of John Hinckley and the places he had been in the organizations he belonged to, along with Joseph Franklin. Franklin had been in these cities where there were murders that he's possibly linked to. Known cities he visited: Oklahoma City, Columbus, Ohio, Montgomery, Alabama, Florence, Kentucky, Lockland, Florida, Charleston, West Virginia, Fort Wayne, Indiana, Salt Lake City, Utah, Buffalo, New York, and Maryland. Now, in New York City, they have a person with a Georgia license they're bringing back as a possible relationship to the Atlanta killings. And I know New York is a big state and heavily populated, but he had links through known Nazi and a provocateur through these areas. John Hinckley Jr. belonged to the Nazi Party in Texas, in St. Louis, Missouri, and Chicago. He wrote letters frequently to the Nazi Party in North Carolina. And there was an article in Newsweek about his contacts in North Carolina and quotations about his telephone calls to that group. Newsweek reported April 13th, 1981, Hinckley confided some of his ideas in about a dozen letters to Harold Covington, who was then a Nazi leader in North Carolina. Covington said that Hinckley was unhappy in Lubbock, Texas, and that he talked about moving to North Carolina. The Nazi leader is quick to note that all of our discussion about violence was conducted on a purely theoretical plane. He didn't say, let's go kill the president or anybody else. I took the map of Hinckley's locations because he traveled all over the place to some of the similar cities. And as I say, he was in the Nazi Party in Texas, St. Louis, Missouri, Chicago, and corresponding, if not visiting, North Carolina. He was a member of the Denver Posse Comitatus, a radical group that have been against labor organizations and politically active. He's part of the National Constitution Association, which had training camps for killing federal agents and links to Georgia, Colorado, and Arkansas. He lived part-time in Dallas, Texas, Lubbock, Texas, Houston, Denver, Colorado, outside of Denver, Lakewood, Colorado, Nashville, Tennessee. He was in Atlanta, Georgia, New York, New Haven, Connecticut, Hollywood, and so forth. This Hinckley got around similar to Franklin, but he also had other characteristics. The photographer, whose name he gave as a reference for a job in Hollywood, said that he didn't know much about photography, but he had handcuffs. He had hollow bullets, a lot of bullets, an arms cache in Nashville. He was in contact with the North Carolina Nazi group that I have been told, I can't verify it yet, are linked to the Atlanta, Georgia killings of the black children and young adults in Atlanta, Georgia. And when he went to the photography place, he said he was interested in children. That's completely out of context with Hinckley's role, but with the handcuffs and the children and the Atlanta and the North Carolina and the other organizations that train for killing, the National Constitution Association and the Posse Comitatus, they're the group that would take over the sheriffs, the right to bear arms and take over, arrest, and round up. They're their own private police force. And I think that there are too many reasons to suspect the mobility and the money. Franklin's wife, ex-wife, who knew him under a different name, she didn't even know the name Franklin, said that he had to be paid and supplied with the means to get around. The same thing happened with James Earl Ray when he was in the penitentiary in St. Louis, Missouri. The House Select Committee hearings opened up the fact that there was a druggist, a pharmacist in the prison, and that James Earl Ray was allowed to escape, and there were 3 or 4 men in St. Louis, Missouri that put up a bounty of several $100,000, up anywhere from $200,000-300,000 to almost $1 million to kill Martin Luther King, and that it came from the South, and so that there was a chain of command to release him. And then James Earl Ray traveled all over the country, and he was in Hollywood, and he was down in Tijuana, and he went to bartending school. The Hinckley boy did bartending, and he was in Montreal, and he was even in London and Portugal, and he traveled from Los Angeles to New Orleans and Memphis, Tennessee. He had mobility in all kinds of situations and had a location where if he wasn't a patsy, he could have been a gunman. If he was a good patsy, he wasn't in the Lorraine Motel. The gunman allegedly was down on the street. But these people have endless contacts. They're released from jails. They're given a lot of money, clothes, women, whatever they need, and they travel around. So that this Hinckley fellow, John Hinckley, his family is closely linked to the Central Intelligence Agency, and I'll do more next week on that through the church group called World Vision, and I'll talk about that. And then the father had 2 agencies in Houston, Texas, that the Dallas News wrote about, Vanderbilt Energy and Vanderbilt Resources. Now, Resources was in Houston, where the CIA headquarters are of John Connally and George Bush, and that ball of wax that I'm going to discuss on the other side of this program, the other side of the tape. But Vanderbilt Resources was a telephone number that was relayed somewhere else, so that the Hinckley family had the World Vision as a CIA front in many, many countries, working directly with the Defense Department, and they had World Resources. They had George Bush, the 2 sons, not only were having dinner the next evening, but Scott Hinckley and Neil Bush have to be closer, one in oil engineering, the other with the Standard Indiana, the oil company there. Socially exchanging dinners is pretty thick, this ball of wax that's coming down. And Hinckley's family links with the Bush CIA director, handcuffs that could be used for kidnapping, arsenals of weapons that have never been fingered or identified where the other guns are that he had. 3 were taken at Nashville, but where was he getting the ammunition? It came through police force or the special security forces used for hijacking the hollow bullets. So who supplied him is going to be cut off. We'll never know the hard parts of this case any more than any of the other cases. He had the hatred. He had the Nazi group. He was more violent than the other Nazis. He wanted to kill or bomb. And it's quite possible that his links in California to the Nazi Party, he flew out to California before he went east and was in California for long periods of time. That's where Thane Caesar is. He's down at Riverside, California, a man who killed Robert Kennedy, the security guard who shot Robert Kennedy from the back of the head. Thane Caesar is in Riverside, and he's a member of the Nazi Party and an organizer there. And the Nazi Party runs throughout the state with the same intent to provoke race riots. You see, the Manson family was set up by the Defense Department and the CIA for provoking riots. To get the race war on, they wanted to have the weapons and start fighting this race war, which they think is inevitable, and they'd like to go out and kill blacks anyway. So Hinckley was too violent for the organized Nazis, but he's perfect for a provocateur. And I believe that taking these people in Atlanta, Georgia, is for the sole purpose of getting the blacks to be aroused. If they don't do anything and they act dumb, like dumb Jews in Germany, they get wiped out anyway. And if they get aroused, then the others come out with the guns and shoot them and prove that they're impotent and can't move because they're way outmaneuvered. And if they have a temper tantrum and burn a building down, they say, we don't condone violence, and this isn't an eye for an eye society. So they're going to be losers, whether Atlanta, Georgia is 24 today or 2 million tomorrow. These people are poking holes into a society to make it bleed and hurt and enjoying every single minute of it. So Hinckley has this capability, close contact with the CIA and his family with the CIA at the time. George Bush was director, and he must still, you never stop being the director of the CIA, even if you're vice president. He has the intent for the provocateur kind of violences. He had handcuffs. He had arsenal of weapons. He was protected by the FBI that wouldn't fingerprint him. The judge that said he walked off, didn't go for his arraignment or hearing for having weapons at an airport, identical to the Manson family, where people were complaining about them having drugs and narcotics and girls under 18 years old. And the sheriffs were told at Topanga Canyon, don't touch the Manson family, leave them alone. They were some kind of kindred soul. A friend of mine, Preston Guillory, was in on the arrest of the Manson family, and I've mentioned this with you at other times. And the law enforcement wanted them to come down. We had to have some terrorists here, such as the Mansons and the SLA, in order to get the SWAT teams for the future food riots and the labor riots, and that's why all of this was allowed and it's created. This Hinckley boy was in New York. He was in New Haven, just covering the motive of Jodie Foster. And I read this week that this McClendon, who has the controlling stock of Columbia Studios that made the movie Taxi Driver, the man with the most stock there, is a Texas oil millionaire, a far, far right-wing oil millionaire from Texas. This man's name is Gordon McClendon, and he's into diamonds, from diamonds to metal now. He's a multimillionaire, Texas multimillionaire, owns radio stations and has been on the radio for years. He's the major stockholder of Columbia Pictures, a right-wing politician. There was an article about him just this last week in the San Francisco Examiner. This is the person who has a big influence over Columbia Studios, and they made the movie Taxi Driver. We have to have our fall guy or our motive. It can't be communism anymore, such as the system has tried to use before, because we want China as our ally and they're communists. So we have to use the word terrorist or have a motive for assassinating public figures, such as seeing a movie. There's a lot of good films. I'm surprised they just didn't go into the movie Nashville. That's a natural, about a fellow that stalks the country music and a politician gets up there and then he opens up his guitar case and guns him down like the other banana republics that the CIA put into power. I'm sure that when they use up Taxi Driver a few times, then they'll go down and use the movie Nashville. But maybe they didn't want to call attention to it right now because John Hinckley got off on the arrest charges down there in Nashville, and so they didn't want to call attention to that city at the present time. Hinckley, as I say, was asking the photographer in Hollywood about interest in children. But with an interest in children, a hatred of people, mobility around the country, links to the Nazi Party. A lot of people get confused because the first picture published of him in St. Louis in the Nazi Party wasn't his picture, so there was a lot of headlines, it's not him in the picture. Nobody denied he was in the Nazi Party, he just wasn't photographed in St. Louis. But the Nazi Hitler Youth all look alike. That's what Hitler wanted, that they all have the same head structure. He used to measure against a wall the perfect youth. He'd measure the width of their fingers, the length of their feet, whether they were narrow or wide, their facial characteristics and their bodies, and put them up against a wall to get the perfect body. And what he got was a lot of people that looked alike. He got what he wanted. So whether it was John Hinckley in St. Louis or not isn't the question. As I say, it could have been a clone of many kinds of people that look exactly like him. And that wouldn't be a coincidence, it would be an intent, because that's the kind of features they're looking for. One reason I caught on to the possibility of Hinckley being involved with this Franklin and with the worldwide and American Nazi Party was the way the silence of the case came down when he was flown immediately to that military base in Quantico, Virginia, and to Durham, North Carolina, and silenced, and everything about him taken off the news. He hasn't even been charged for shooting a policeman or the press secretary, Brady. Now, this was a well-photographed ambush on the American streets. We didn't get to see the killing of Harvey Milk and George Moscone, but this was a real ambush, heavily armed. He was able to get off those 6 or more bullets in 3 or less seconds, and we saw them all fall down and bleeding. We talked about that last week. But the point is that this whole story faded. Within 2 days, almost every article that I have on Hinckley is just seeping through from a few publications, a few Texas newspapers, from the People's World. The hint that this was a big story was the mentioning of Edward Bennett Williams as the attorney to represent John Hinckley. I touched it briefly last week. and or the week before, and I'm going to do on the second half of this program, who is Edward Bennett Williams, and then we'll know more about the shooting of Ronald Reagan and the other people in Washington, D.C. One of the reasons I mentioned this kind of money being used for news media, we know it's used for weapons and for torture and for murdering masses of the population, is that the media really has to be controlled in order to keep people from getting these stories or making these connections. You're allowed to see a single article if you're lucky, but nobody in the United States hardly is even getting anything on the Nugan Bank, maybe 2 articles, the rest came from Europe. It's really a tragedy to be cut off from the media and the information. There's a conference in New York City for people of alternative media, such as myself. I got some literature before if I wanted to apply for some kind of a grant or a suggestion of what my tapes are like. They're having a conference on small radio stations and small people like myself having programs of interest that maybe could be on a broader scope. But the people in charge of the program, the mail comes out under a big envelope from Larry Josephson. He was the dirty dog at Pacifica Radio who made sure that Bob Fass and I got off the air. I was on there constantly, and they played the radio tapes from 1972 to 75, and we used to do 4- and 5-hour talk shows. And people were really catching on to what's happening in the East Coast. I got to make many friends who are still taking these radio tapes, and I got to meet them at the Elgin Theater. But Bob and I were taken off the air, and Larry Josephson was one of the people at the station that wouldn't let us talk about fascism or Ronald Reagan or Nazis, but they controlled the alternative media in the same way. And then another person on the board putting on this program is Frank Mankiewicz. Well, that's like going to a conspiracy conference and listening to Mark Lane all over again. These men have a tight control over the subject that is very important, disseminating information to people, just as Bill Moyer was on listeners-sponsored radio and TV with his show about America. He was press secretary to Lyndon Johnson and kept the lid on all the assassination conspiracy researchers and work and evidence. And then he gets on the stations, the alternative stations. He's giving out the same kind of BS as Cronkite, only it's the alternative radio, and that's the way the media is controlled. And it really must take big bucks to control the media in such a way. I mentioned Jonestown last week and the money coming from Europe, and Michael Kilduff's book, The Suicide Cult, has a one sentence in there. By 1963, Jim Jones Church was going full speed, and pretty soon he lost a job program that he thought he was secure in having. It was a $350 bill, but he goes on, money was always a mysterious commodity for Jones. Even though he didn't like to take money, it started coming in. And as they mentioned in the book, Kilduff mentions in the book that he had a lot of money. It was always a mysterious commodity. Now, I don't see how writers, and again, this gets to the media, how can people write about Jonestown or write about Gene Harris, who killed Dr. Tannauer, or write about Mark David Chapman, or when Alan Lowenstein was murdered, Dennis Sweeney. How can people write articles and books without knowing who pays for their travels, who put them in these mental hospitals, what was the diagnosis like this Dennis Sweeney, and with the others, how did they make these trips? Who did they see on these trips? This Gene Harris, before she shot Tannauer, there was one article that she was in California just before she shot him. Now, I read this last week she was in California and also in Colorado. Nobody testifies at her trial her state of mind when she went to these two cities. Who did she see? Because she was obviously under mind control. The people that worked with her at the school, Madera School, before she went up and shot Dr. Tannauer, said she was in a glaze. She didn't communicate. She was starry-eyed. She didn't hear what they said. She was in a catatonic state. All of a sudden, she leaves the room and comes back, and her whole personality has changed. And she's actually probably received a phone call, and she's been told to go do it. And she's in that state of mind, and off she goes. And how come when you write about Jim Jones, you don't say money is a mysterious commodity? When it's that mysterious, it usually is CIA money. And there is no mystery about how Jim Jones got his money, or Mark David Chapman. There has to be a reason or a way, and that's the way I started studying the Kennedy assassination, looking for the money behind Lee Harvey Oswald, because it's the money that matters. It used to be cherchez la femme, now it's cherchez la dough. And when you find out where the dough is, then you know who gave the orders for the hit. Another article this last week in the Washington Post: banks are being robbed, embezzled at a record rate. Now, one of the reasons they have to go into these robberies is because so many of them are linked to the intelligence community and to the far-right group, and money being taken out with the collusion of people at the bank and being put into weapons to control repressive regimes and bring narcotics back into the states. And this cycle has to end at some point. And the Washington Post brings out the fact that there were 800 cases of embezzlement the FBI investigated last year, of more than 100,000. And it refers to the Wells Fargo case again in Los Angeles 2 years ago. 10 million was gone, and now at the Wells Fargo they still go with 21 million. And they talk about the various bank robberies, and 45 million from bank robberies in 1980. This is just 45,600,000 in San Francisco, 800 in New York, 1,000 in Los Angeles. Now, those make up practically the total for most of the bank robberies in the country, and many of them, as I read to you on the air several weeks ago, many of those have inside information. The driver, the name of the driver, the route, the names of the children, and so forth. There was a skyjacking attempt, not to get too far off bank robbery. I want to get back on that again. But weird things and weird people are happening. There's skyjacking in Los Angeles at the airport last week. The man who got on the plane, Victor Malasukis, had a gun, and the airport will not say how he got through security. They said, we don't want to give out our secrets or discuss it. He worked for the aerospace industry. He was working for a PhD in physics. He was going to the University of Rochester, New York. He didn't have his degree yet, but he had a job as a technical engineer, and he worked at Jet Propulsion Laboratory, an educated man, and when he was arrested, he had no memory or recollection of taking people hostages. He couldn't remember anything except heading towards the airport. He doesn't remember getting on the plane. He doesn't remember the gun. And now they're saying diminished capacity. But what this does is give the appearance that we have a lot of terrorism in this country, and terrorism is the word that is going to give Ronald Reagan or Haig the excuse to take control of the United States. So these attempts at counterintelligence that I said would come much more frequently once that Ronald Reagan was in office, they're coming so often I don't even have time to go through half of them and share them with you. Another article, a security guard slain in mystery shooting. Remember, Mark David Chapman was a security guard in an apartment, the one that shot John Lennon. This has to do with the San Francisco Chronicle article. A 22-year-old private security guard was mysteriously shot and killed before his horrified girlfriend in the lobby of a welfare building. The gunman shot 4 shots with a .38 caliber pistol, again at close range, and the gunman said it was a total random shooting, and they left. It's just the homicide of security guards is taking place frequently, and also security guards are shooting. And I have a whole list of people, arrests, and murders that are strange that we don't have time to go into each one of them. One L.A. police sergeant charged with vice and aiding and drug dealing, and there's a picture of him, Sergeant Eugene Ingram, and he ran a house of prostitution for Japanese people and Japanese clients. And again, this was in the Hollywood area. He had places in Hollywood and downtown, and the Wells Fargo case involved one bank in Hollywood, and also the Japanese mafia, the implication of using Japanese contacts for much of the operation and the money washing. So this police sergeant is charged with aiding drug dealers, and he's involved with Japanese clientele, the Hollywood division, and he was picked up last week. More charges against the Hollywood policeman came in, the Hollywood division, and so forth. Interesting story about his being picked up. The $1 million bail sent in weapons drug cache case, that's the one I mentioned a few minutes ago. It had a lab making Quaaludes and LSD. It did not involve weapons going to South America or a murder, and this person was put on $1 million bail, and the one who'd been in San Quentin in prison for 15 years on murder charges and violence and weapons of all kinds, and even linked to a missing person right now, is out on $5,000. Another robbery in West Germany. West Germany's huge bank heist, $1.3 million. They now went to the home of the people. I might have mentioned this to you before. I don't remember if I did or not. Just last week they took $1.37 million and said to the bankers, take us to the bank and get the money out. And they went to the safe deposit and got $820,000 and said, don't be worried, we won't hurt you. We've done this before. So they just tied up the kids and went off with that money. There's another story in the New York Times that's an interesting one that really gets complicated. Another lot of money, a lot of countries, a lot of contacts. This man is now locked up behind bars. At least he is. He hasn't gotten out yet. Eduardo Rabi, his name is R-A-B-I. You might have seen the article. He uses the name Jack Bender, and allegedly for 28 years he's compiled a dossier on himself. He's living in a New York penthouse. He traveled between South America with Rolls Royces, had a home in Monte Carlo and Paraguay and Uruguay, wanted for $60 million worth of swindles. His name and background are a mystery. According to the New York Times, he's been arrested 6 times, convicted twice, never in prison. He made millions of dollars, and he got arrested in Manhattan this last November because of swindling a Mexican woman and also a very bright girl from MIT out of what he said was going to be an investment of her money. So he was picked up, and he said he was a Uruguayan importer, and he uses different names and different passports. He has passports from Lebanon and Canada and Uruguay, and he travels between California, Canada, Switzerland, France, Monaco, Italy, and he's in Panama and say Uruguay and Paraguay. His family name, he said, was Rabia, and he was born in Baghdad and Iraq, and then they checked that out, and there were other birthplaces that he gave himself. He said he emigrated to Israel after their independence in 1948. He got his first conviction in 1952 by Interpol, and in Italy in 1957, and was using Lebanese passports. Was arrested in Toronto, where $1.4 million was missing. Now again, bag man carrying money down to Uruguay, and then he mixes up with Mengele and that genocidal group down in Uruguay. 1.4 million missing when he was arrested in Toronto. He went to prison and pretended that he was paralyzed or had a stroke, and then got up and walked out, again in the hands of the police, and walked out. He was in Los Angeles in November 1968, right after Robert Kennedy was assassinated. He used the name Walter R.B., but he had a British passport, and then he left there in a hurry, arrived in August, and then left in a hurry, and his location was an empty place with a desk and a telephone, and then went to Germany, went to Frankfurt, Germany, Paris, London, Monaco, under the name of Jack Bender, and then went to Uruguay and Montevideo and in the early 70s, and formed the Pan American Financiera real estate conglomerate with Panama, Paraguay, Uruguay. And again, Panama and Torrijos and the narcotics traffic and the Jones banks and the Nugan banks and Nugan Australia and the Wells Fargo Australia. There's overlaps of cities. It doesn't prove anything conclusively, but the intent of all these people of working with the same kinds of people and their paths going back and forth and millions of dollars being transferred, we should be able sometime to make a pretty good collection of evidence to demand that various charts or maps be presented to members of Congress for some kind of an explanation. He was in the importing and exporting business and had long stories. He had a major Swiss insurance company in which he invested $50 million, and then he claims he lost it. Well, is it like the Nugan hand that he really lost that money, and where did it go? Or is it like the Nugan hand that it was intelligence money that was brought in, and he was just the bag man with every kind of a passport and every way to get out of arrest, and he could continue traveling all over the world? He had $1.5 million from Balfour Williamson, which was a Swiss finance company. Then he went down to Paraguay in 1978, and he was arrested by the Paraguayan police and had a nervous collapse and an out-of-court settlement. Then went to New York and said that he paid Paraguay $2.5 million in cash in order to get out of there, and that he left $13 million to get out of Paraguay. Now, he may say they were chasing me out of there, so I had to leave it there. Was he a bag man who was delivering this money, like from the Bahamas down to Paraguay, and from the Swiss banks to Paraguay, or the Nugan hand to Paraguay? Was he working in with Nassau, Bahama, and this Castle Bank, where they had money flowing out? They had millions, up into the billions, into these banks in the Cayman Islands, in Panama, by the CIA, that then flows out. Well, why wouldn't it flow into this man's hands? He's never been arrested. He goes country to country. The only reason he's been picked up now is that he messed around with a young gal and tried to sell her something that was fraudulent and on a minor thing, and she pressed charges, and he's probably done it 100 times and nobody pressed charges. But he says he lost $50 million in one Swiss insurance company, and then he had to leave $13 million when he left Paraguay, and he was in New York in 1980 with this fancy apartment with a Miss Del Mazo, MIT student, a graduate student from Mexico. He sold her $100,000 of worthless shares in a meat company in Denver, Colorado, and of course, as I say, Jean Harris overlaps her trip to Los Angeles and to Denver. We can't prove anything. I keep repeating, but these people have traveled to China, to the Middle East, to London, to Germany, and the important thing about it isn't just that they hit those cities, it's that you have to read 300 papers a week to just find that they were in fact there. In other words, what would make very interesting stories isn't being told. I simplify it for you because 1 hour a week I tell you where these people were, but I have to sit sometimes 12 hours a day, 3 or 4 days, going through literally hundreds of newspapers each week to pick up these little pieces. This story was in the New York Times, but then the story about Jean Harris, maybe the Denver thing, was of all the things that were trial, was in one Washington Post or one New York News, just one piece here and one piece there, and you find that they were crisscrossing the same kind of routes. So he had sold her something in Denver, Colorado, and she arrested him, and he's supposed to be in jail now. The last article that came out, the Associated Press this week, is Swindler Behind Bars, and has to do with the matter of the selling her as part of a chicken ranch or a fraudulent investment that didn't hold. But I'm sure with his contacts that he will be out very soon. Now, the long article in the New York Times, and it was a long article on this man, and it was also reprinted in our San Jose Mercury, leaves out something which the Globe put in. And they're interested in Megalese. The Globe is like the Star and the National Enquirer. And what the great New York Times leaves out was that this man was down in Uruguay. He left Monaco and Switzerland and went to Paraguay. And then he made associations down in Paraguay with General Andre Rodriguez, the number 2 man of the Paraguayan dictatorship. And he says he's the one who saved him from prison, I guess, for getting all those millions of dollars. But when his immunity ended, when Robbie began to suspect that a top banker in the country was actually the notorious Nazi angel of death, Dr. Mengele. He asked General Rodriguez if Mengele had an interest in my bank, where I was depositing $600,000, Rob asks. And he said yes. And then Rob says, I stopped using the bank, but later the general wanted me to sign over $14 million in land to make up for his losses, and they told me I wouldn't get out unless I did it, so I paid $14 million ransom to escape to Uruguay. So that this Mr. Raab is in the contact with Mengele in South America, who is a direct partner who has access to $14 million of this international con man. And I think that the scandal of not bringing his relationship and his banking to the front has to do, again, with what they would call national security, the Castle Bank, the Grand Caymans, and that missing money. They don't want to come up with where it is because it would link the CIA, and you wouldn't want the CIA to know, tell you that they were funding Mengele for experiments on Indians and natives and possibly the people at Jonestown through, again, colonial dignitad contacts that he's very much a part of. This has been hushed by the media because it is a big story. The millions and millions and millions of money going to the far right, keeping the people down, suppressing them, starving off the natives into real genocide, and calling them banking failures. I don't think they're banking failures, and the story of this one man down there with Mengele tells a lot. It also tells you about the New York Times leaving something out that the Globe was willing to print. I'm in touch with the Globe, and I sent them my document on Mengele being an American citizen, and there's a good possibility that they're going to print that now. They've done 2 stories on Mengele. Finally, I'll do one big missing story. It was in the San Francisco Chronicle by Warren Hinkle, Hinkle's journal, a financial scandal that rattles the Pacific. Now, this is the story that I briefly mentioned to you before about a fellow from the Philippines named Dewey D. And this isn't on the Associated Press, United Press, and if you see it in other newspapers, send me the clipping. Dewey D is a rich young man out of Manila who lives in the Philippines. He's the mysterious Mr. D. He's sort of a one-man Chrysler Corporation who went over the wall with the government lunch money. He's a capitalist Robin Hood who takes from the rich and gives to the richer. He's one of the biggest crooks in the Philippines. He's a friend of the dictator, President and Mrs. Ferdinand Marcos. And when he disappeared, they believed that it was a clandestine flight with capital from the Philippines, and no one knows where it ended. Now, he left the Philippines. This article came out February the 3rd, just last month, 1981. He left there with this large amount of money, $70 million or more, out of the Philippines, to deposit probably for the Marcos in another country. And the point is that he has emptied the country out of money, and the Philippines owes the World Bank, so that the United States citizens will have to take out their tax money to make up for the difference going to the Philippines, because we have to still, in quotes, support them. They are a bulwark against communism in Asia. You've heard that one before. This story says that this rascal Dewey D is reputed to be so rich he has dollar signs on his socks, and he's linked, of course, again, to organized crime. He's like the Asian Rockefeller. He may even be the Asian Vesco. Warren Hinkle used to work with Ramparts magazine and does freelance writing. He was stripped of his epaulets as director and owner of the Security Bank of Manila. He cashed out the bank owing $2.5 million and skipped away with that and resigned, and then he left 2 Filipino partners with $18 million purchased in Redwood City National Bank in California, and he took that $18 million. He took $50 million of other bankers' money from the Philippines and went out of the Bank of Manila and took this money with him. And they believe that he is investing it in other matters and probably salting it away, such as the Perones did, in case the Philippine government were ever to fall down. This article says the mystery is the story of how Dewey D got out from wonder with his bank control in the Philippines how one man could manage to borrow so much money in so short a time and get out of the country with it. You know, at Wells Fargo, they were saying that Harold Smith got a hold of $21 million in a short time by just going to Australia. There's no way that amount of money could leave the country, according to Warren Hinkle, without someone high up in the government knowing about it. He has friends everywhere in investments all over the world, and he has taken large amount of money, and the article says that the flight of capital from the Philippines, it may suggest that the Marcos will fall, such as the Shah in Iran and Somoza and Nicaragua, and we have to have a new set of money. What if the generals and the Catholic Church and so forth come in? We have right now a set of oligarchs and the Marcos and the president, but what if that falls? So he's taken money from a bank in California that he had and other money from the Philippines. 50 to 70 to $100 million is gone, and as I say, the article says that eventually, when he takes that, ultimately the American government, which is propping up the Marco regime through the World Bank loans, is the major guarantor, and the people of the United States will have to make up the difference. One of the subscribers to my tapes, listens every week, sent me a second part of an article, part 2, The Money Makes the Mob Go Round, The Invisible Enterprise, from Forbes. This is October 13th, 1980, just before the end of the year. And it talks about the organized crime and the loot that they have and how they invest it into the United States. They give the example of the Westchester Theater in New York and the washing of money by the mob into businesses in the United States. It's a good article, and you can get it at the library. Forbes, October 13th, 1980, by James Cook, on organized crime coming into the money market. Now, if organized crime takes their money laundering and builds restaurants or dry cleaning places or puts it into business, it is visible in some other form. They can buy up franchises and control all of the mozzarella cheese and the pizza parlors and maybe the taco places or whatever, and they're putting it back into a business. But what I'm talking about in terms of the possible Wells Fargo money, that whether it was $200 or $300 million, or the Nugan Hand money, or the banks, the Cayman banks in the Bahamas, the Panama money, the Jonestown money, the Nugan Hand franchises were definitely CIA assassination, killing money. And when you pay $1 million to one person for killing off the President of the United States, memos in the Howard Hughes collection sent $1 million to Richard Nixon at Key Biscayne, give $1 million to Lyndon Johnson in Texas. That wasn't just because they weren't going to run again or because they were good boys or they were particularly loyal to the Howard Hughes empire. The Hughes empire was another CIA funnel of money, and it went to the assassination teams. Johnson was president because Kennedy was murdered, and Nixon was president because Robert Kennedy was murdered. And never forget that. This was killing money, and then there's a lot of people to pay off, and the people that keep quiet and the entourage around them, and then fanning out the levels that rub next to them, maybe innocent or dumb or suspicious. There is talk in Washington and coming out in various books about almost common knowledge of the conspiracies and how they came down, but nobody yet is willing to take a giant step and scream, we've had enough. But when the banks begin to get siphoned out of all this money, and it's missing money, and you've invested along with them, then your investment is shaky. And when the FBI has to begin investigating banks that are cracking up to the tune of so much money, and if it's just going to assassination teams, then something has to give, and eventually they're going to have to finger how Jonestown came down, who funded Mark David Chapman, or Gene Harris, or many, many other people, how they get to Europe and Asia, and their living quarters and transportation and so forth. And the problem of mixing all the intelligence, killing money with ordinary money of investors, is that the investors will get burned out until the government and the FBI call a halt, which isn't likely with Ronald Reagan in office, because the whole entourage around him are so closely tied to the assassination teams. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. You take care, and I'll be back with you next week.